Picture this: a planet shrouded in perpetual mist, where ancient fortresses rise from poisonous swamps and the very ground bleeds with dark energy. This is Dathomir, home to perhaps the most feared and misunderstood Force users in the entire Star Wars galaxy, the Nightsisters. These weren't your typical darkside wielders driven by rage and ambition like the Sith. No, the Nightsisters were something far more complex, far more dangerous, and ultimately, far more tragic. Today, we're diving deep into the complete story of the Witches of Dathomir, from their mysterious origins in a distant galaxy to their catastrophic downfall during the Clone Wars and their surprising return in the era of the New Republic. We'll explore how these dark side matriarchs managed to create a society that could wield the power of darkness without being consumed by it, how they tamed rancors and raised armies of the undead, and how their unique philosophy challenged everything we thought we knew about the Force itself. This is the story of power, betrayal, survival, and revenge that spans millennia and connects some of the most pivotal moments in Star Wars history. So settle in, because the tale of the Nightsisters is unlike anything else in the galaxy far, far away. To understand the Nightsisters, we need to travel back through time and space, literally to another galaxy entirely. The story begins not on Dathomir, but on a distant world called Peridea, located in an extragalactic realm that existed long before the events we know from the Star Wars saga. On Peridea stood the ancient witch kingdom of the Dathmiri, the true ancestors of what would become the Nightsisters. These weren't primitive mystics stumbling upon dark powers. They were an advanced civilization that had mastered one of the most incredible feats in galactic history. They had tamed the Purgle, those massive space whales capable of traveling through hyperspace. Think about that for a moment. While most civilizations were still figuring out basic spaceflight, the ancient Dathmiri were riding living ships across the void between galaxies. But why leave their original homeworld? What drove them to make the ultimate journey across the galactic divide? The answer lies in the nature of their power itself. The Dathmiri had discovered something that would become central to their descendants' abilities. They had learned to tap into the planet's very life force, what they called ichor, a magical essence that flowed from the depths of their world. When they eventually discovered the planet they would name Dathomir in honor of their origins, they found it wasn't uninhabited. The Fromprath, a technologically advanced species, had already claimed the world and were strip mining its resources. But the Dathmiri saw something the Fromprath didn't. They saw a world saturated with the same dark energies they had learned to harness on Peridea. What followed was one of the most fascinating conflicts in Star Wars lore. Rather than engaging in a purely technological war, the Nightsisters formed an alliance that would define their culture for millennia to come. They bonded with the apex predators of Dathomir, the mighty rancors. Imagine the sight: witches riding into battle on the backs of creatures that could tear apart battle droids with their bare claws, wielding powers that could animate the dead and create matter from thin air. The Fromprath never stood a chance. They were driven into exile, forced to abandon a world they thought they owned to a group of mystics who understood that true power came not from technology, but from harmony with the planet's dark essence. For centuries, the Nightsisters flourished. They entered what historians call the Golden Age, a time when multiple clans of Nightsisters lived in harmony across Dathomir, each developing their own unique traditions and specializations while sharing the common bond of their magical heritage. But like all Golden Ages, this one was fragile. The various clans began to drift apart, their unity fracturing as different groups pursued different interpretations of their ancient ways. The Nightsisters were on the verge of collapse, their civilization fragmenting into warring factions that might have destroyed everything their ancestors had built. That's when she appeared. Mother Talzin, a Nightsister whose iron will and political genius would reshape the destiny of her people. Talzin didn't just reunite the clans through diplomacy or force. She forged them into something stronger, a single, unified clan that could face any threat the galaxy might throw at them. Their first attempt was subtle. They tried to poison Dooku using Nightsister magic, but the Count's connection to the dark side allowed him to survive. So Talzin decided to escalate. She had another son, Savage Opress, Maul's brother, who was living among the Night Brothers. Using their most powerful magic, the Nightsisters transformed Savage from a relatively normal Zabrak into a towering monster of rage and strength. The transformation scene is one of the most disturbing displays of Nightsister power we've ever seen. They didn't just enhance Savage's physical abilities, they rewrote his very nature, turning him into a weapon of pure destruction. The ritual involved the combined power of the entire clan, channeling Ichor through ancient spells that had been passed down through generations. Savage's mission was simple: infiltrate Dooku's inner circle and destroy him from within. For a while, it worked. Savage became Dooku's new apprentice, and his raw power was so overwhelming that even the Count struggled to control him. But the Nightsisters had underestimated Dooku's cunning and overestimated their ability to control a being they had transformed so completely. When Dooku finally discovered the truth about Savage's origins, his retaliation was swift and merciless. He didn't just seek revenge against the Nightsisters, he saw them as an existential threat to the Sith Order. Here was a group of dark side users who had proven they could create warriors powerful enough to challenge Sith Lords, and they had done it while maintaining their independence from the rule of two. Dooku's solution was characteristically brutal. He dispatched General Grievous, the cyborg general whose hatred for Force users was legendary, to Dathomir with orders to exterminate the Nightsisters completely. The Battle of Dathomir was unlike anything seen in the Clone Wars. When General Grievous arrived with his droid army, he wasn't facing a conventional military force. He was attacking a fortress filled with witches who could raise the dead, transform matter with a thought, and command creatures that could tear apart battle droids with their bare hands. The Nightsisters threw everything they had at the invading army. They animated their own dead sisters, creating an army of zombie warriors who felt no pain and knew no fear. They sent their rankers charging into the droid lines, massive beasts that could crush entire squads with a single swipe. They used their magic to create illusions, turning the battlefield into a nightmare landscape where reality itself seemed to bend and shift. For a moment, it seemed like the Nightsisters might actually win. Their magic was proving effective against the droids, and Grievous himself was struggling against opponents who could attack him with powers he didn't understand. The sight of undead Nightsisters rising from their graves to defend their home was enough to give even the fearless cyborg pause. But the Nightsisters had one crucial weakness. Their power was tied to their fortress and the network of Ichor that flowed beneath Dathomir. Grievous, with his analytical mind, quickly identified the source of their strength. Rather than continuing to fight the symptoms, he went straight for the cause. The destruction of the Nightsister fortress was a tragedy that echoed across the galaxy. In a single night, a civilization that had endured for millennia was reduced to ruins. The survivors could be counted on one hand. Asajj Ventress, who was away from the fortress during the attack. Mother Talzin, who used her magic to escape into the spirit realm, and a handful of others, including the young Nightsister Marin, who would carry the burden of being among the last of her kind. The massacre served multiple purposes for the Sith. It eliminated a potential threat to their power, but it also sent a message to the galaxy. This is what happened to those who opposed the dark side's new order. The Nightsisters had proven that there were alternatives to the Jedi-Sith dichotomy, and for that they had to be destroyed. But even in defeat, the Nightsisters' influence continued to be felt. Their destruction created ripples that would affect the galaxy for decades to come, and their survivors would carry on their traditions in ways that even Sidious couldn't predict. The aftermath of the massacre forced the surviving Nightsisters to completely reimagine what it meant to be a Nightsister. With their civilization destroyed and their numbers reduced to a handful of individuals scattered across the galaxy, they had to adapt or die. Asajj Ventress chose the path of the bounty hunter, using her skills as a warrior and her knowledge of the Force to carve out a new life in the galaxy's underworld. but she never truly abandoned her Nightsister heritage. When she later worked with Jedi Master Quinlan Vos in an attempt to assassinate Count Dooku, she tried to teach him the Nightsister way of using the dark side as a tool rather than a master. Mother Talzin retreated to the ruins of the Nightsister fortress, where she continued to plot against Sidious and work to heal her son Maul's broken mind. Her attempts to regain power, including the kidnapping of Bardotan Queen Julia, showed that even in exile, the Nightsisters remained a force to be reckoned with. Perhaps the most interesting survivor was Merrin, a young Nightsister who had been just a child during the massacre. Left alone on Dathomir with only the Night Brothers for company, she had to figure out how to preserve her people's traditions without the guidance of the clan mothers who had been lost. Merrin's story represents something unique in Star Wars lore: the evolution of an ancient tradition in response to near extinction. She maintained control over Dathomir during the Imperial era, commanding the respect of the Night Brothers and keeping the planet's dark energies contained. But more importantly, she began to question some of the fundamental assumptions that had guided her people for generations. When she eventually encountered the Jedi Knight Cal Kestis, Merrin made a choice that would have been unthinkable to previous generations of Nightsisters. She chose to trust a Jedi, to work alongside him rather than treating him as an enemy. As she explained, Nightsisters and Jedi do not travel together, but survivors. We adapt. This adaptation wasn't just about survival, it was about growth. The Nightsisters had always been isolationists, viewing the outside galaxy with suspicion and maintaining their independence at all costs. But the massacre had shown them that isolation could be a weakness as well as a strength. Meanwhile, other survivors were making their own adaptations. Morgan Elsbeth channeled her rage over the massacre into a different kind of power. She became an imperial shipwright, using her position to plunder worlds and build the fleet that would serve the Empire's expansion. Her story shows how trauma can drive individuals down vastly different paths, even when they share the same origin. The Imperial era was a dark time for Force users across the galaxy, and the surviving Nightsisters were no exception. Emperor Palpatine, the same Darth Sidious who had betrayed Mother Talzin decades earlier, maintained his paranoia about potential threats to his power. Even though the Nightsisters had been virtually wiped out, Sidious still feared their return. He stationed Imperial garrisons on Dathomir with orders to report any attempts by surviving Nightsisters to leave the planet. The message was clear. The Nightsisters were to remain extinct, and any attempt to rebuild their civilization would be met with overwhelming force. But the Emperor's fears weren't entirely unfounded. Small groups of Force users on Dathomir continued to use the Nightsister name, including a sect known as the Nardithi Nightsisters. These groups represented something that Sidious couldn't tolerate: proof that the Nightsister way of thinking could survive even the destruction of their civilization. The story of Jersera, a member of the Nardithi Nightsisters, illustrates the complex relationship between the Empire and surviving darkside users. She was captured by a female inquisitor and trained as an apprentice, but eventually betrayed her master and took her double-bladed spinning lightsaber. This wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a rejection of the Sith way in favor of the Nightsister philosophy of self-preservation and independence. During this period, we also see the return of Nightsister spirits, summoned by Maul and Ezra Bridger during their attempt to merge a Sith and Jedi holocron. The spirits' demand for flesh and blood to rebuild the Nightsister clan reveals something crucial about their nature. Even in death, they were still trying to preserve their people's legacy. The spirits' attack on Kanan Jarrus and Sabine Wren showed that Nightsister magic could transcend death itself. They possessed the two rebels, turning them into weapons against their own allies. But Ezra Bridger's decision to destroy the altar that powered the spirits, rather than giving them what they demanded, showed that the Nightsister way of pragmatic survival had limits when it came into conflict with moral principles. By the time of the original trilogy, Dathomir was considered a dead world. The few surviving Nightsisters like Sheelish were scattered across the galaxy, reduced to teaching their traditions to individuals like the smuggler who would lead the Anoat sector uprising. The great civilization that had once tamed rancors and defied the Sith had been reduced to whispered legends and half-remembered rituals. The story of Mother Talzin's final confrontation with Darth Sidious represents the ultimate tragedy of the Nightsisters, a people whose greatest strength, their unity, and loyalty to family became the weapon used to destroy them. Talzin's love for her son Maul never wavered, even after Sidious had stolen him and twisted him into a Sith apprentice. When Maul returned to Dathomir with his mind shattered by his apparent death and resurrection, Talzin used all her power to heal him. She didn't just restore his body, she helped him rebuild his identity as a Night Brother and a son of Dathomir. But Maul's return also gave Talzin something she had been waiting for, a chance for revenge against the Sith Lord who had destroyed her family and her people. Together, mother and son began to plot the elimination of both Darth Sidious and Count Dooku, the two Sith Lords who had brought such destruction to the Nightsisters. Their plan was ambitious and showed the full extent of Nightsister strategic thinking. Rather than attempting a direct assault, they orchestrated a complex scheme that would force the Sith to face them on terms favorable to the Nightsisters. They used Maul's connection to the criminal underworld to build a power base, while Talzin worked to increase her own strength through mystical means. The final confrontation took place on Dathomir itself, in the ruins of the fortress that had once been the heart of Nightsister civilization. When Sidious arrived with his forces, including Count Dooku, he found himself facing not just Talzin and Maul, but the full power of Nightsister magic channeled through their ancient homeland. The battle that followed was unlike anything seen before in Star Wars. Talzin, drawing on the planet's ichor and her own mastery of dark magic, was able to match Sidious in raw power. For a moment, it seemed like the Nightsisters might finally have their revenge, that the betrayal of decades past might finally be answered. But Sidious had learned from his previous encounters with the Nightsisters. He understood that their power came from their connection to each other and to Dathomir itself. So he did what he had always done. He turned their strength against them. He used Maul's love for his mother as a weapon, forcing Talzin to choose between her own survival and her son's life. In the end, Talzin made the choice that defined the Nightsister way. She sacrificed herself to save her family. Her death marked not just the end of the unified Nightsister clan, but the end of an era. The last great mother of Dathomir was gone, and with her died the dream of rebuilding their civilization. The death of Mother Talzin left the surviving Nightsisters more isolated than ever. With their greatest leader gone and their homeworld reduced to ruins, it seemed like the Nightsister way of life was destined to fade into history. Asajj Ventress, despite her apparent death while protecting Quinlan Vos, had actually survived and continued her life as a bounty hunter, but her survival came at a cost. She was now truly alone, cut off from the last connections to her people and their traditions. The knowledge and wisdom of the Nightsisters lived on in her, but she had no one to pass it on to. Merrin, still on Dathomir, faced a different kind of isolation. She was surrounded by the Night Brothers who served her, but she was the only one who truly understood what had been lost. The responsibility of preserving Nightsister culture fell entirely on her shoulders, and she had to figure out how to do that without the guidance of the clan mothers who had raised her. The scattered nature of the survivors meant that the Nightsister traditions began to evolve in different directions. Each survivor adapted their knowledge to their new circumstances, creating variations on the original teachings that reflected their individual experiences and needs. This fragmentation represents one of the most poignant aspects of the Nightsister story. A culture that had prized unity and collective strength was now forced to survive through individual adaptation. The clan that had once been able to coordinate their magic across an entire planet was reduced to isolated practitioners working alone. But even in this dark period, the core philosophy of the Nightsisters, Their pragmatic approach to survival and their refusal to be defined by others' expectations continued to serve them well. They didn't give up or fade away. Instead, they adapted, evolved, and waited for their opportunity to return. The fall of the empire and the rise of the new republic created new opportunities for the surviving Nightsisters, but it also brought new challenges. The galaxy was changing, and they had to decide whether to remain hidden or to step back into the light. Morgan Elsbeth's story during this period shows both the potential and the dangers of Nightsister survival. Her rise to power as the Magistrate of Caladan on Corvus demonstrated that Nightsister discipline and strategic thinking could be just as effective in peacetime as in war. But her alliance with Grand Admiral Thrawn also showed how the trauma of the massacre continued to influence Nightsister choices decades later. When Ahsoka Tano and Din Djarin confronted Elsbeth, they weren't just facing an Imperial remnant. They were facing the last heir to a broken civilization. Elsbeth's defense of Caladan wasn't just about protecting her position. It was about preserving the only home she had been able to build since the destruction of Dathomir. The revelation that Elsbeth possessed knowledge of Peridea, the original homeworld of the Nightsisters, changed everything. For the first time since the massacre, there was a possibility that the Nightsisters might have surviving relatives, that their civilization might not be as extinct as everyone had believed. The construction of the Eye of Sion, the massive hyperspace transport ring that Elsbeth had commissioned, represented something unprecedented in Nightsister history, a return to their original role as travelers between galaxies. But this wasn't just about exploration, it was about reunion and potentially revenge. The journey to Peridea brought together elements of the Nightsister story that had been separated for millennia. The Great Mothers, ancient Nightsisters who had remained in the original galaxy, represented a direct link to the civilization's earliest days. Their alliance with Thrawn showed that even in exile, the Nightsisters maintained their pragmatic approach to survival and their willingness to work with anyone who could help them achieve their goals. The return of the Nightsisters to the galaxy represents both a culmination and a new beginning. When Thrawn's Star Destroyer arrived at Dathomir carrying the Great Mothers and their mysterious cargo, it marked the first time in decades that the planet had been home to a significant Nightsister presence. But this wasn't just a simple homecoming. The cargo that the Great Mothers brought with them from Peridea suggests that they have plans that go far beyond simple survival. The coffin-like containers loaded from the catacombs hint at powers and resources that could reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. The Great Mothers' alliance with Thrawn also represents a fascinating evolution of Nightsister philosophy. These ancient witches, who have slumbered for millennia, have awakened to find their descendants scattered and their civilization destroyed. Their response has been to ally themselves with one of the Empire's most brilliant strategists, suggesting that they see the current galactic situation as an opportunity rather than a threat. Elsbeth's death during the battle on Peridea marks the end of one chapter of the Nightsister story, but it also represents a kind of redemption. She died fighting alongside her people's ancient protectors, wielding Mother Talzin's own sword and empowered by the magic of the Great Mothers. In her final moments, she wasn't an imperial shipwright or a planetary magistrate. She was a Nightsister defending her clan. The future of the Nightsisters remains uncertain, but their return to Dathomir suggests that their story is far from over. The Great Mothers possess knowledge and power that predates even the ancient Sith, and their plans for the galaxy are only beginning to unfold. The story of the Nightsisters is ultimately about the cyclical nature of power and survival in the Star Wars galaxy. They began as refugees from another galaxy who found a new home and built a civilization that lasted for millennia. They faced near extinction, but survived through adaptation and determination. And now they have returned, carrying with them the accumulated wisdom and power of their entire history. What makes the Nightsisters unique in Star Wars lore isn't just their magic or their matriarchal society. It's their refusal to be defined by the traditional categories that dominate the galaxy. They aren't Jedi or Sith republic, or empire, light or dark. They are something else entirely, a civilization that has found its own path through the complexities of the Force and the challenges of survival. Their philosophy of using the dark side as a tool, rather than a master, offers a fascinating alternative to the binary thinking that has dominated Star Wars storytelling. The Nightsisters prove that it's possible to wield great power without being corrupted by it, to face extinction without losing your identity, and to adapt to changing circumstances without abandoning your core values. As we look toward the future of Star Wars storytelling, the return of the Nightsisters opens up new possibilities for exploring the nature of the Force and the diversity of approaches to wielding its power. The Great Mothers and their mysterious plans represent a wild card that could reshape the galaxy in ways we can't yet imagine. The Nightsisters have always been survivors, and their return to Dathomir proves that some traditions are too strong to be destroyed by war, betrayal, or time itself. The witches of Dathomir are back, and the galaxy will never be the same. What do you think about the return of the Nightsisters? Do you believe the Great Mothers will be allies or enemies in the ongoing struggle between the New Republic and the Imperial remnants? And what secrets do you think they brought back from Paradia in those mysterious coffins? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden corners of Star Wars lore.